If I'm allowed to start, I'd actually like to pay tribute to him because he has been an extraordinary and is an extraordinary chair of that select committee. And throughout the deliberations that we've had on this deal, other deals and other matters around trade, he's carried through, despite some of the disagreements that we might sometimes have, but he's managed to get through a very, very lengthy trade agreement, at times with great frustration. And I think it's right to pay tribute to him. And it's also right to pay tribute to the Secretariat, who have done an extraordinary amount of work and have found it as equally frustrating as we have when we haven't had the scrutiny, when we haven't had the access to ministers that we would like. It should be no surprise, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I am supporting this bill, and given the course of this debate, we haven't really spent a great deal of time of actually speaking about the contents of this bill, and that's because it's remarkably uncontroversial. And so, in this instance, but what I want to make the point about is that wherever we have gone in terms of our objectives and our ambitions to sign new trade agreements, we are confounding the expectations. It wasn't that long ago that when we talked about signing a trade agreement with Australia or New Zealand, the opposition benches were saying that that would be impossible and that we wouldn't be able to do it within the timescale. Well, we have done that. And now we're looking faster than expected on New Zealand. And as I said earlier in an intervention, we're already in discussions with the Gulf Cooperation Council, with India, with the Comprehensive, Progressive and Trans-Pacific Partnership, with Canada. And we've also got the Singapore Digital Partnership under our belt, as well as the Japan Agreement under our belt. And to discount those is an enormous mistake. Because actually, when we look at what we've done in terms of Japan and what we've benchmarked on digital trade, it is truly a remarkable thing that the UK has done, because the world is now following our agreements around digital trade, and it will be an enormous benefit to our businesses, to our services, and to this country. The striking thing to me, though, in the course of this debate, has been the discussions of import impacts versus export opportunities. And I'm not remotely surprised to hear from the opposition where they are saying what imports will impact us in the most adverse possible way. What has been underestimated and not been given the full attention that it should have is the opportunity that we have in the exports. And it was already said by the honourable member from Mole Valley about whether it was machinery, whether it was professional services. We have to look at this in the round, not just cherry-picking the bits that we think are going in a good way or in a bad way. We have to look at them as a whole. And to that point, when we look at the Australia Trade Agreement, and I will come on to farming in a second, when we look at the Australia Trade Agreement, we are saying that farmers may have come off adversely. Now, I don't happen to believe that to be the case. What I want to look at is all the trade agreements that we will end up signing by the end of this Parliament. Because the honourable gentleman and I, when we went to the Middle East to do a study on whether or not we should join the Gulf Cooperation Council, there we sat with farming, the little amount of farming that takes place in that region, and they said actually a trade agreement with them would be hugely advantageous. The NFU has come out on record saying that actually an agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council will be a massive boon for our farmers and for our domestic food producers in this country. So we can't just look at one trade agreement and then therefore... Yes, of course.
Yeah, just reflecting back at that and the big dairy production we saw in the desert, did he not get the feeling that that being born from the blockade of Saudi Arabia on Qatar, that they might be very, very keen to protect that, and that might be a protective matter, a defensive trade interest they might have going forward? So it might not be what we assume for our farmers across the nations of the UK because of that very reason.
It's a perfect example, and actually what we saw in Qatar was small in comparison for what they've got in Saudi Arabia in terms of a 30,000 herd strong milking parlour versus one that is in Saudi Arabia, which is 200,000. So yes, it's an absolutely fair point, but it's also the meat market that's there that opens their doors to us, and I actually think that the NFU's insight into this has been particularly useful. It's important that we don't cherry pick on this. We have to, as I've said already, is look at them in the round. And I come on to the point that I made in an intervention earlier to the Honourable Member and Chair of the Select Committee, which is about these economic forecasts. One of the best examples of where a forecast has been fantastically low and totally underestimated was America's membership and agreement through NAFTA. Initially, the membership of NAFTA actually projected very low growth, very low opportunity, and actually the reality for that has been very different, because over time businesses evolve, they take advantage, and the onus now is on the Department of International Trade to ensure that we are reaching out to businesses across the land, to ensure that they are taking the opportunity that is available to export, to get the benefits from imports of parts or anything else that may come under that. So we do need to make sure that when we talk about these figures, while they might seem low, or they might seem insignificant at this point, I think we have to also think about the expectation of how we want to see our economy grow, how we want to see businesses develop, and how we want to actually be able to exchange the benefit of services and industries. And I'll take his intervention in 1 second. The other point to this, which was made by the former Secretary of State for Scotland, whose constituency I can't remember, he made the point about professional qualifications and equivalence on that. That is an enormous opportunity for us to see where we can share and develop those sectors. He wanted to intervene.
Yeah. Very, very grateful, the honourable member, again forgive me from talking this. And the Deputy Speaker might well remember when he was an august and esteemed member of the International Trade Committee, that one of the things we discovered early on in the very, very outset of the negotiations and discussions with Australian and New Zealand trade-interested people was the most important thing that could be done overnight was the Home Office visa and work visas easy up. So it requires government as well to be aware across departments that they make sure that these things can happen because they're not being silly and obstructive in particularly the most silly and obstructive department I think that we have in government, regardless of who's in power.
Delighted with the honourable gentleman's comments, because here he is asking for Whitehall and Westminster to sing a better tune and to work better together, and truly he's going to be a parliamentarian here for many, many years to come. So I'm delighted with that, and of course, you know, I am still trying to fill your shoes, Mr Deputy Speaker, on the Trade Committee and doing my very best on it. But I think when it comes to farming, and it was the point absolutely put forward by the member for Wyre Forest, which is that we've been talking about the impact of imports into the country, but we're not talking about the consumer choices. Now, I just posed the question to the House. When you look at any of the major supermarkets or purchasers of food abroad, what do you think their environmental, social and governance policy is going to say when it talks about meat purchasing in the UK? Do you really think that members in this House would find it acceptable if Tesco's, Morrison's, Aldi, Lidl or Waitrose or whoever it may be started importing meat of a lower quality that probably, in all honesty, does not fulfil their ESG obligations? So that consumer choice is already there, and the opportunity for us, both on the EFRA Committee, on the Trade Committee, as members of this House, as constituency MPs, can make that case and ensure that actually they're not purchasing that meat if it doesn't meet those standards. I think that's a very effective tool that has been overlooked on this. Now, I'm not saying that everything is right for farmers on this. There are serious concerns, and I thought it was absolutely right that it was put forward for the lady from Louth and Horncastle, thank you very much, who made this point about small farms. Well, I do think DEFRA has taken some steps in where they've pushed in the right direction to make sure smaller farmers are working together in a more effective manner, to make sure that we're actually looking at purchasing power so that they can rival some of the bigger farmers. We do need to continue to have that conversation. We do need to ensure that we are providing the reassurance. And this, Mr Deputy Speaker, brings me on to the point about scrutiny. I have got quite animated about this subject in the past, and I have to say it begins with a bit of an apology to the member for Huntingdon, because when I was first elected to this place in the very early days of discussing free trade agreements, he vociferously stood up and made the case about why the Cragg process was not right. And in my youthful enthusiasm, I stood up and said that he was wrong and that the government system under Cragg was absolutely perfect. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, on the record, I was absolutely wrong. The member for Huntingdon was absolutely right, and I thank him for his time and his expertise in talking to me about how we might be able to improve Cragg. As the member for Wyre Forest said, we on the Trade Committee have worked extraordinarily well on all political colours to make sure that scrutiny was at the heart of what we were trying to do. The fact that we had to go through 8 volumes and 2,000 pages of the Australia Trade Agreement and countless hours to make sure that we could even try and produce a report on the UK's first major trade deal was a tough challenge at best. But to not have access to ministers at the beginning and as the process went through was not an acceptable one. I do ask the minister who's responding to this, we must make sure that the process is better in future, because this can't be allowed to continue. But what we asked for was, as was outlined under the Labour provisions of Cragg, was that the House, as already has been said, would essentially, when CRAG was initiated, we would have 21 sitting days to be able to have a debate and a votable motion on whether or not to extend the CRAG process for a further 21 days. Members of this House would have had the power to continually do that if the questions were not being answered or if the government decided not to table that free trade agreement. Well, on the 19th of July this year, I put forward a SO24, which the Speaker rebuffed me on, but very graciously gave me an urgent question, to actually make the point of why we need to have a debate on free trade agreements. Now, we on these benches, and I hope the opposition won't take this in the wrong way, we have far more rural constituencies on these benches than the opposite benches. The government should not be afraid of their own back benches having the conversation to discuss the merits or implications of free trade agreements, so that we can return to our constituency and speak to the CLA, to speak to the NFU, to make sure that we're having the conversation that will actually alert them to the impacts and the positives and negatives wherever they may be. Unfortunately, the clock was run out. Now, we cannot legislate for the government to absolutely find time. And I have said this to the Chief Whip and to any ministers that will listen on this, is that I do think the government needs to consider adding a clause to this bill, a new clause to this bill, which would actually enshrine the scrutiny process. Because if this bill doesn't pass, we can't actually ratify the Australia or the New Zealand trade agreement, and I hasten to add that we haven't even produced a report yet on the New Zealand trade agreement, so the House hasn't even had time to see the expertise of the Trade Committee and its Secretariat and obviously the Chairman's views on this. So we do need to consider that, but I really would, if I can put it as bluntly as this, in the Minister's closing statement, I would like to hear some assurances around what we're going to do on the scrutiny process. We deserve a say in this House. We deserve a say on the free trade agreements. I happen to be very optimistic, not naively optimistic. I have to be optimistic about the trade deals we are signing, because there is real opportunity to the services, the producers across this country, and we should welcome them. And in fact, even in the course of this debate, there have been a number of things that I suddenly thought we might be able to export. From the Shadow Minister, we could be exporting signed copies of his book to Australia. From vintage cars, we could be able to make sure, it may albeit one of them, and perhaps the price coming down. We have to take the opportunities to the advantage of this. I might just end on this point, which is that perhaps one of the greatest moments on the Trade Committee, and the Chairman is far too humble to mention this, was when I think it was the Australian Trade Minister sitting there talking about what he was doing, and the Chairman decided to pop outside to do some lambing, came back in with a newborn lamb, which he decided to christen Dan to Han in honour of the Australia Trade Agreement. But there is big opportunity here for us to actually make sure we get our scrutiny process right. We improve it both in committee and in this place. We have, as the NFU, and has been put forward by their excellent spokesman yesterday, the point is that members have that right. They have that opportunity. We've got to balance off imports versus export opportunities. We've got to talk about consumer choice and the competition within the market. Because I have to say the trade agreement is going to deliver more than this Australia trade agreement, I think, is going to deliver far more than people expected to. And when you couple it with all the many other things that will be done through the GCC, India, Canada, as I've already said, we will see enormous benefits. So I thank the Secretary of State for opening remarks and look forward to the Minister's response.